There's a possibility Nigeria might delay the presidential election scheduled for February 14th. The country's national security advisor is asking the Election Commission to hold off so more voter cards can be distributed. The terror group Boko Haram has stepped up violence in recent weeks, as many of you know, threatening the safety of the election process. Well, just today, there are reports of a major new offensive against the city of Maiduguri. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is in Lagos, as we reported, urging both President Goodluck Jonathan and opposition leader General Buhari to maintain peace before and after the election. In other parts of the world, Russian-backed rebels in East Ukraine are on the offensive. After taking control of the airport in Donetsk, they are vowing to push Ukrainian troops out of the region. Now, this is the deadliest violation yet of the ceasefire that took effect back in September. The United Nations reports that almost 300 soldiers and civilians have been killed in the latest outbreak. Well, Steve Acunto is from the Council of Corps College. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Joe.
It seems like the elephant in the room right now is Russia. They say they're not helping the rebels, but can we count on that to be fact or fiction?
Well, they say they're not helping the rebels. We say we're not opposing them other than the sanctions. There's a lot of definition problems here. No one's calling this a war yet. No one is saying, I mean, we're hearing this morning, Secretary Kerry said, we're very angry. Others have said, the ambassador to the United Nations, we're extremely concerned, unacceptable. All of the language is being used. But in my opinion, Russia is backing the rebels. I think it's obvious from the nature of the weapons that they're using.
Sure.
And I believe as well that the motive, you'd have to be pretty inspired to be a rebel in the first place, and then to be able to sustain that, you have to have some kind of backing. It's not coming from their own resources. It has to be coming from somewhere.
There has been rhetoric, of course, that has been spewed on both sides. Most recently, of course, President Barack Obama at a press conference this morning with the Prime Minister of India basically saying, look, you know, what we are against is a nation of size and power going against a smaller nation, for instance, this case, of course, Russia and Ukraine. With that being said, Steve, there's also a talk on the right that's saying that President Obama perhaps is not doing enough. Of course, his response is, well, look, all we can really do at this point is keep the pressure up involving sanctions, although we don't want to cripple the Russian economy. What else? I guess the question is, what else can be done?
Prayer. I mean, the answer is the sanctions are working, and that's giving motive to Putin, in my opinion. You know, there's never been a revolution or a conflict like that that hasn't been born of discontent. The ruble is in the dumpster, and Vladimir Putin knows that. Where does he go? He's got a tripartite Eurasian mini version of the European Union with Belarus and Kazakhstan. Where does he go? He has to, in my opinion, give a cause to his people to endure the bad economic times, to endure what they're reading about coming from the Ukraine. I don't think he's got any place to go but to continue to be aggressive in this respect.
Well, perhaps so. Right now, from what we understand, his popularity is still high in Russia. I mean, if things start to turn worse, which they possibly could, maybe that will change. But here's the deal. What he has been doing now, he's been banning certain imports from Western countries, specifically the United States, coming into this country. Well, obviously, that affects his countrymen, but it also affects manufacturers and businessmen in the West and the United States.
Yes, and that has been a problem for the United States, because there are European businessmen who would like to see the sanctions lifted. This was expressed, I believe, in Davos last week at the World Economic Forum, that the sanctions are hurting. They're also hurting the sanctioners, if you will.
Yeah.
And I don't know how long that can last. I mean, I don't see another move in the offing right now toward, I mean, the rebels will continue to move forward. There's no question. They're going to continue until they're absolutely stopped. And that will take more, I think, than the Ukrainian army.
Okay, what is the end game here for Putin? Because Crimea probably is a foregone conclusion at this point.
Yes.
But you're talking about eastern Ukraine, you're talking about some of the Baltic states that are surrounding areas, some of the former satellite states now of what used to be the Soviet Union. Where is the end game for Putin?
In a very short answer, which I'd like to give a much longer one, but in a short answer, Julian, I think the ultimate goal is federalization in some form or other. whether it's trade compacts again, whether it is this idea of sharing in energy. There has to be, his goal has to be some return to a federal state, including Ukraine. And don't forget, at the base of a lot of this is a national sentiment in Russia regarding the seat of its faith, which is Kiev. Kiev is Rome to Russia, as it would be to it in Italy. I've said it before on the show. If Italy has a Rome, Russia has a Kiev.
Okay, well, Steve, that's kind of a disturbing point then. If that is the case, there's not going to be any stopping until there's been some kind of reversal. And he said before in statements to the effect that he would like to see some sort of return to what was the Soviet Union. I mean, so if that is the case, and military option, or the military option is not an option, what are we facing?
I think we're facing the play out until he becomes unpopular as a consequence of economic misery. Don't forget, the misery index economically in both countries, Ukraine and Russia, is very high. While he's popular, he's continuing to provide goals, ambitions. He controls the country with a group of basically of plutocrats and now there are other small fractional groups that are part of his coterie. When that begins to fade, and I think it will naturally, then you'll have a change in this idea of a federated a series of countries. The Eurasian thing is not working. Right. He's got Kazakhstan and Belarus. That's it. Meantime, in the Baltic states, they're arming themselves. The Baltic states are actually arming themselves. There is talk of a return of nuclear weapons to Poland on the U.S. side. There is discontent in Georgia and, of course, a greater fear than before because of the incursion in Ukraine. So he's going to either have to do the whole thing, in my opinion, within the span of his tenure, or face the idea that the federated Soviet Union won't return. That's a very long sentence. Well, I apologize for that.
Steve, and we got to move on to a few other items before we go here. Sure. But, of course, the scientists are saying now with global warming and the nuclear arms buildup, the doomsday clock is now down to, the 3 minutes before midnight. I hope that's not the case. But before we move on, though, I want to ask about NATO's involvement or influence in this. How much influence do they have here?
It's a loud noise. I think if the Ukraine, the idea for Russia that Ukraine could be in NATO is a game changer. And I think it's possible. I just think that the United States has not put its spine behind the Ukraine yet. I think it's put its words. I think it's put sanctions against Russia, which have hurt the U.S. as well, the import-export situation. But I don't think yet that last piece, the NATO inclusion, has been played, and I'm sure it's not been played. I believe it will be, and I believe that is the winning card.
Okay, we want to move on to a few more topics here. First, starting off again, we're talking about this, of course, with James Carville. Congress inviting Netanyahu over here to speak to the joint session. Your views on that? Well,
the president invited Cuba back to the table, if you will, and he didn't. It was a surprise to everyone when he announced it. I don't know. There was a term used in the Kennedy administration vis-a-vis Johnson called
Wait a minute, hold on, back. So you're saying is what's good for the goose is good for the gander?
Well, I mean, if we're playing one-upmanship, show me the next card. I mean, and that's what I think is happening. I believe you go back to, it was a book quite a few years ago about the Kennedy administration, which called one-upmanship was the style of can you top this among competing political enterprises at the time.
But he's a sitting president, Steve. Come on.
But making a move like reopening Cuba, that's a big move. And I don't know if he got the sign-ons from anyone but...
But we haven't normalized relations with them fully. I mean, the embargo is still on.
He sent down, to open up the embassy, he sent a team down. The governor of New York was down. I mean, let's put it this way. It is a one-upmanship game. I don't think it was smart, personally, for Congress to invite Netanyahu like that. I think it was bad for Netanyahu. Potentially, he could be damaged by it in the election. And I think it was essentially a show of disunity here, which this country can't take.
Do you think, Steve, in any form or fashion, that Congress would have a problem with what the president did, as opposed to what John Boehner did in this particular case, not even consulting the president about this move?
The question
during an election, 2 weeks away, Steve.
It's gamesmanship. All right. But the question is, does the U.S. support Israel? And if we do, then it's a blip on the screen having the president come over and address Congress. Maybe he's not getting a hearing in the White House.
All right.
I mean, give the benefit of the doubt. I just think that the atmosphere is, the president's atmosphere approach is, I'm going to veto what you send me. I'm going to do Cuba. They come back with, okay, we're having a speech by Netanyahu. It's not beautiful, but that's the game that's going on right now. All
right, look, you know, my old, not Kenny Stabler, you got to know when to hold them, when to fall. The wild card in all this.
What?
The wild card in all this, the Pope. The Pope has been vocal on a number of issues, and apparently, even with the whole situation with Cuba here, he has come in and he said a few things. I mean, is the Pope being more influential now than any other popes have been?
I mean, he took the name Francis.
And it's Kenny Rogers.
But okay, he took the name Francis, which refers back to Francis of Assisi, the great Catholic saint of peace, of love of animals, love of nature, and of respect for other humans. That was a big step and a big noise. In the Philippines, he made an unfortunate remark or two, but think about it. He's president in Cuba, president in the Philippines, remaking the church by having the preponderance of new cardinals non-Italian, non-European, as a matter of fact. This is a revolutionary figure who has acceptability, since we don't elect him and he's not responsible to us. He's got acceptability based upon his good messages.
And he's wildly popular.
He really is. In the Philippines, he's a rock star.
Now, what were the unfortunate remarks you were referring to?
Well, he made the remark about we shouldn't procreate like rabbits, and I think what he meant by it and what the rollback was kind of explains he didn't mean to make a comment that was so blatant. It was not a beautiful comment to have made.
Yeah. Look, let's move on here. You know, of course, capturing the headlines for the last several weeks, of course, has been the situation in France and the terror move over there, the no-go zone, so on and so forth. You know, a certain network being sued now by the mayor of Paris for a mea culpa, apparently, here. The fallouts from the Paris attacks. What do you see as a fallout there, or fallouts as opposed to for what has happened over there?
This morning in Pakistan, there was a demonstration of people, according to the news report, beyond what you could see from the television. That many people, maybe 400,000 or 500,000, which included obviously religious influence, but again opposing the publication of those cartoons. On the other hand, in Europe, you have a rising right wing, no question. Demonstrations in Cremona, Italy, by leftists who oppose a rightist. I mean, now it's starting to come out. In Hungary, there is a rightist party. Marine Le Pen is gaining some traction. In France, there's talk of Jewish people who wish to return to Israel, fearing that there's a rise of anti-Semitism, which is cloaked in right-wing anti-immigration rhetoric. I think this is the fallout. The fallout is not greater freedom of the press. The fallout is a polarization of factions.
Do you think by any chance, Steve, that we might see anything close to what we witnessed in Nazi Germany back in the 30s, leading up to World War II?
No, I don't think we'll see that. I think what we will see, however, somewhere along the line, there has to be a strengthening of immigration. If the motive, even if the motive is racial, the play out of it will never be anything like Nazi Germany, because that's, you know, if history repeats itself, it does, of course. You don't have something that's that fresh in the conscience of the world playing out again without objection. I mean, the laws, there isn't a law in any land that could be supered that would allow that, in my opinion.
Look, you know, of course, that act was unconscionable. You know, nobody can condone anything that happened over there in terms of those attacks. But clearly, on the other side, we live in a cause and effect universe. There are problems there that need to be addressed, and hopefully, perhaps, they might be addressed now as a result of what has happened.
You know, I'd like to amend what I said, Julian, if I may. There is a possibility that could happen, that there could be a Nazi-styled purge somewhere, but I think it would be on the part of some of these jihadists who are taking land over and running things as if they were fascist dictators.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's a point for another debate and another discussion. Steve Acunto, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Julian.
All righty.
Thank you.
Well, there's much more ahead on the Rise Review. Of course, stay with us.